Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our webinar series at ESA. Once again, I'm Executive Director Joe Schwanek with Environmental Services Association of Alberta. Today's webinar, When Worlds Collide, Integrating Soil and Groundwater Studies when Remediating and Risk Managing Upstream Oil and Gas Sites. So Brent Lennox has been kind enough to join us today from Waterline. Brent's presentation's about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up as always to questions. We'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions. Afterwards, by the end of the day, I hope the video and the PowerPoint file as a PDF will be available on our website. So I'm going to turn it over to Brent now.
All right. Thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join me for this webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about how we create how we work to consider environmental issues in a holistic way, and that's considering soil and groundwater when we're remediating and risk managing upstream oil and gas sites. So I'll just provide a brief introduction to those of you who aren't familiar with Waterline. We're an environmental consulting company and a hydrogeology consulting company with our roots in hydrogeology. We have 50 staff in Alberta and BC, so we're a bit larger than some people sometimes think. We're really focused on quality and also try to find that balance between quality and being cost effective as well, as all of us have to do nowadays. Because we're not a large multinational company that's fully integrated, we are frequently collaborating with soil rec companies and other specialty companies. Since the downturn that seems to be persisting for a long time now, we get brief interludes of stability, but we're back into that recession mode. We've, as a company, been really focused on improving our in-house technology and improving efficiency through automation of our interpretation and deliverables. Looking at the attendee list as of, I think Friday, it looks like there's a really good mix of consultants, oil and gas, environmental advisors, regulators, some people from colleges, laboratories, and even a lawyer. So we have some good variety of backgrounds at the talk. I think that this talk is going to be largely focused on the people with more of a soil rec background, and because I feel like that's most of the industry, and here we go. So I think that there's three approaches that we can take as practitioners. You'll see this in the various studies that are completed when we're doing background reviews. There's I think particularly in Alberta, there's a separation between soil and water. So practitioners, so you can just focus on water, so just focus on soil, or maybe there is the option to think more on an environment level. And I think in Alberta, there is a tendency to focus on what we're familiar with. So soil people that are more familiar with soil data will focus on soil with water in the background, and people with more of a water focus will maybe put that data front and center, with soil being in the background. But I think that the environment doesn't really work by separating the media that we're working in. And I think that, for example, if there's a spill, the spill and the hydrocarbons that have, say, for example, that have been spilled don't really care that we separate our subdisciplines. They're going to move through the natural environment how they move. So I think we should be moving towards a more holistic, all-inclusive way of doing things, where we consider both soil and water. I just thought I'd show kind of the typical workflow in our industry. You have the phase one to figure out whether there's potential for contamination by doing a background review. That may move to phase two, where you're doing an intrusive investigation and collecting actual data from the site, and that data may tell you that remediation is required. But basically all roads lead to reclamation, and if all things go well, a reclamation certificate. And this workflow, I think, is primarily done by people with more of a soils focus. So when we bring groundwater into the equation, we have this interesting change in the workflow, and some may call it a wrench in the workflow. So instead of our tried and true pathway, these sites may be kicked into the arrows in red, where, for example, there's someone's doing a phase two, and they identify shallow bedrock, and groundwater is impacted in that bedrock, and then it gets kicked to this groundwater monitoring phase, which can sometimes be a continuous phase, but if it's not managed properly. But I think there is a way to get out of the endless cycle of groundwater monitoring, and that's by focusing on actually understanding what the site's about. So understanding receptor risk, and also understanding what guidelines are appropriate, such as Tier 2 guidelines. And this may allow us to eventually get back to the path that we, I think, all want to get towards, which is reclamation and regulatory closure. So I think there's also been a change in the regulations since 2016. That's a rough date, but I do think that in the past, environmental regulations were largely separated by media, and in approval required work, they continue to be separated by media, with kind of I don't know, what I'd call more of a checkbox approach to, if you do these certain things, then we have a good, that means that you've met your approval, and we're good to go. You've written a good report. You look at the more recent regulations since 2016, and we have they're, in my opinion, a bit more interesting. They're more focused, have more of a tendency to take a holistic approach. They're more open-ended and provide, a lot of them, the documents are guidance and guides rather than the checklist approach. And I think they, a lot of the regulatory requests recently from AER have been more asking bigger questions and promoting longer term thinking. With this regulatory push, I think there is, obviously there's increased complexity for the practitioners because we have more regulatory guidance to review and look at. So it does get, it can be a lot, but I think at least for risk management and groundwater related sites, we are going in the right direction. So thinking about, I'm sure the regulators on the webinar may have some different opinions. This is an opinion piece by myself, but I do think that since AER's inception, we've basically been we've basically been in inventory mode. So figuring out what's out there, what's the environmental liability, and is it appropriate, is the assigned liability for a given asset or facility consistent with the actual environmental liability, and then finally is a plan in place to manage these impacts. The three regulatory mechanisms that I just wanted to highlight would be the the site-specific liability assessments, where some sites are going towards being designated as problem sites. You have the figuring out a plan, the risk and remediation action plans, and then finally the record of site condition. I mean, that's been around for a while now, but the new iteration is interesting in that it allows, from my understanding, AER to better manage workloads and prioritize files that they're going to work on. So if I'm looking at the ways that the regulatory mechanisms to encourage the oil and gas companies to, I guess, behave in a certain way to basically manage environmental liability, we have, I can't see your faces now, so I don't know whether you're amused by this regulatory carrot approach, but that approach is more about, it's more of like a positive reinforcement mechanism. I think that although there are hiccups with well site assessment, remediation, and reclamation, I think in general the outcomes are relatively more predictable than some of these other more higher risk sites. And I think that it's, it has obvious regulatory rewards that are easily understood, not only by the regulator, but also within an oil and gas company. The VP, the environmental advisor, and the consultants that they hire can easily understand the trajectory of of the way the portfolio is going, and the measurables are easily understood. So that really, I think that regulatory carrot approach works really well. What becomes, I guess, what's interesting to think about is that a site that requires more of a risk management long-term approach doesn't really have the same obvious tangible benefits to site management. So I guess in today's world, the thing to do on webinars and Zoom calls and whatever else is to show pictures of your dog. So I just, I thought I might as well include one, a picture of her, and the analogy of a sleeping dog, I think, is a good one for sites that require long-term management in the scale of decades to hundreds of years. And unfortunately, that first workflow that I was describing doesn't really work as well. The kind of typical REMREC approach for problems that are expected to extend for long time periods and for sites that aren't easily remediated. This leads me to think about kind of bigger questions, like who's going to be responsible for these sites in the long term, and what's the long-term plan? Those questions are the questions that I think AER is asking as well. And this recent COVID situation has made me think about timelines and the interplay between short-term and long-term drivers. I think that the political timescales and regulatory drivers, we're working with four-year cycles. Some of them, there may be some continuity between who's elected and those 4 years, but there's definitely some fluidity to how that affects environmental management. But I think the strongest control on managing environmental issues is related to oil and gas prices and environmental budgets in a typical situation. And so the interplay between those two drivers is I think what dictates what environmental work gets completed. So we're using basically short-term mechanisms for long-term problems, which is the way that our society works in general. The third one, we have this recent federal funding that was announced last week. Now that is an interesting thing that really plays with those timelines, the typical market-driven timelines that we are used to dealing with. So we have this short-term 2-year cash infusion of federal money to the environmental work and abandonment work. This basically is going to skew the market in unusual ways. We're going to be focusing on companies that are close to insolvency rather than and managing those environmental risks rather than than being dependent on companies that are doing basically the best financially that can afford to do the work. I think that this federal funding will definitely help to, it will help keep the industry afloat, and it'll also probably work on the abandoned, reducing the number of wells that are out there that need to be reclaimed. But I don't think it will really, address the sleeping dog type of sites with long-term that require long-term management. And I think in the long run we will see that the legacy and the long-term trajectory will be largely dictated by those sleeping dog sites. So we're obviously in interesting times. People are always saying unprecedented, and what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do to initiate change in a positive way? As a consultant, I think there's kind of 4 things that I wanted to highlight. 1, let's play to our strengths, and 2, let's work together to figure out solutions that will work for our clients. I also will get into this later, but the 3rd point is that I think that it really now more than ever, we need to be offering value by embracing site-specific and tier 2 guidelines, and using guidelines that are appropriate for the actual environmental risk that exists. With everyone being in their dining and living rooms working away, this actually is a good time to reflect and think about how we do things better, and what is next. Anyways, those are the you got to look at things positively, and those are the things that come to mind for me. So I think that part of the thinking positively involves thinking about how to fix the workflow, make our environmental work better than ever. So I'm going to discuss in detail these 3 points on the left, how we can improve assessing pathways, some simple steps that we can, as an industry, use to integrate tier 2 approaches more into our work, for both what I'm going to call easy wins and also the harder wins. And then once we understand the pathways and the appropriate guidelines, we can just easily figure out what's going on with receptors and the risk associated with them. So, and then another thing I wanted to highlight in this flow chart is just that we should be thinking about soil and groundwater, and think about the environment as a whole. So once again, this talk is catered towards soil practitioners. So, so I'm first going to go into assessing pathways and compare the different approaches, and maybe some possible options for improving everyone's practice. At Waterline, we do get to review a lot of files with sites with kind of long-term long-term history, and it is interesting, like to see that this situation of there being this disconnect between how the groundwater is impacted further away from the site, and how the soil, how they're related. And I think it all comes down to pathway. Understanding the geology or the soil conditions is really the foundation of conceptual site models. And I think a lot of this disconnect comes down to us not necessarily speaking the same language between groups. You have the geologists and engineers using the unified soil classification system, and then soil scientists are using a different system. And what's interesting to think about is where does soil end and geology start? I think that once you get to greater depths, the Canadian system of soil classification definitely breaks down and becomes less useful. While on the flip side, you have the unified soil classification system, which really is completely inadequate for topsoil. So what's our boundary? Is there? I think it's pretty hard to set a depth boundary. Is it just below topsoil that we switch systems? Is it 1 meter below, 2 meter, 3 meters below? So looking at the Canadian system of soil classification, I think it was never really intended to be used at depth. So it's not really great at identifying things like gravel, cobbles, boulder, and bedrock. I also, this is entering the realm of personal preference, I guess, but I really struggle with loam and knowing what loam is and how it affects the migration of contaminants through the subsurface. So I'd like to suggest a few that people consider a few approaches. I think that the fine course grain size analysis, laboratory analysis, it's around $10 per sample. It's a really useful training tool. But not only that, but it also gives others the confidence in the logs that are being presented. We can get into more sophisticated methods like hydrometers or sieve analysis, but really consider if we're worried about economics, and hesitant to do grain size analysis, that fine course analysis really helps. I do think that the unified soil classification system is useful, and I'm going to try to convince you why it should be used more. I like that it's percentage based, so it's easy to tell what the constituents are. There's less exceptions. It's like loam. It's easier to understand what is actually what grain size constituents there are in your material. And I think if you do actually get a solid sense of geology, that ties into understanding receptor risk, and understanding your site and conceptual site model in general. The other major benefit is that it has descriptors of that are very useful for figuring out where water table is located, and we'll get into more of that about that later. So in my travels, looking at sites with a lot of history, we have sites where I see the clay under a thick layer of siltstone. There could be different explanations for it, but one of the explanations is probably not that the glacier burrowed under the bedrock to deposit that clay. The other thing that I commonly see is a gravel, a shallow gravel in an area where you wouldn't really expect gravel. And I think both of these situations are related to having an understanding about the drilling method that is being used. So if you have even an auger going through Alberta bedrock, the bedrock is so soft that it's going to pulverize and grind up the material, and it can trick you into thinking that it's either a gravel or clay. So I think when you drill most of the holes, you find that actually most of the geology is fairly consistent throughout the site, and it's just silt over siltstone. I think, yeah, in consulting, there's this tendency to just report results and not to actually interpret. And I think that this kind of philosophy can spill over into geological logging, which I think is not, in my opinion, is not really appropriate. We should be using the best lines of evidence that we have to come up with our most likely probable explanation. All right, so water table is also, because we live in wonderful Alberta, it's also that it can be very hard to identify in shallow, low hydraulic conductivity clays. So we have to assess it if it's present according to the regs, but how do we first identify it? It is hard, and I think that we often find that it's not atypical that you're installing a shallow water table well that's dry right after you install it. Same goes with a lot of siltstones as well. You can, there's definitely some uncertainty when identifying water table in Alberta. I've seen this in excavations as well. Like there's monitoring wells right next to the excavation, but the hydraulic conductivities are so low that the water levels in the monitoring wells are representative of reality, but the dry excavation is not representative of the actual water table. So I'm going to go through a couple tips and hints about how I go about identifying water table. First off, you don't want to be like this guy. You want to do your homework, which is increasingly harder when when you have all these wonderful distractions, being at doing homework from home. I think it's best to, you got to look at your background information that you have on hand. It will provide a lot of clues. There's also always monitoring wells right next to, that may have been drilled already that will give you clues about where water table is expected. I also find that the first borehole that you drill, you're probably not going to have a great idea about what's going on at the site. But once you get going and you've drilled quite a few, your ideas come together. So I think leaving monitoring wells to the last part of your field work and just designing that field program makes a lot of sense. Finally, I think drillers are wonderful, colorful people that we all know well. They've probably drilled more holes than any consultant has had, but they don't normally get to do the follow-up monitoring. So first of all, they're busy with other stuff. And then second of all, they don't get to calibrate their sense of expectations. So I think, not using their opinion for, relying on their opinion for identifying water table is probably a good thing to tell juniors. So getting back to why I'm a big proponent of the unified soil classification system is that it really does help you identify water table, particularly in our very common shallow clays. There's plasticity, basically, which means like whether you can roll up soil into a snake. There's changes in the softness, so whether you can indent it with your thumb or fingernail. So if it's soft, it's more likely to have water. If it's harder, less likely to have water. And then the color can also have an effect as well. So if it's consistently gray, then it's likely below water table. That all seems straightforward in theory, but when you get out into the field, sometimes you see the soil going gray and other times you don't. And so what I like to tell people is that you should rely on 2 out of 3 of these indicators to really figure out where water table is. So in summary, I just wanted to reiterate that consider using the unified soil classification system. Grain size analysis is an inexpensive way to create reliable results. We have to use interpretation and multiple lines of evidence when we're considering geology, particularly if the geology is somewhat complex. And then finally, groundwater. We have to figure out where it is because it's going to really affect our site conceptual model and our understanding of the site. So geology. It's all about geology, and once you have that pathway piece in place, I think our lives become a lot easier. The next point that I wanted to go over is using appropriate guidelines that are reflective of actual environmental risk and receptors. So it's very easy to use tier 1 guidelines, but we're by always defaulting to them regardless of the situation, we are essentially protecting things that don't exist. So instead of drawing a line in the sand and saying anything above is bad, anything below is good, I think that as practitioners, we should be thinking about what a guideline actually means. So and understanding how the tier 1 guidelines are actually derived, I think really helps to inform our practice. So you know, the tier 1 guidelines are good at being protective of like most situations, and that's why they make a lot of sense. But they are quite conservative, and you're considering situations that are likely not reflective of reality at your site. A great example is that they assume that for freshwater aquatic life pathways that the impacts are 10 meters away from the surface water body. And also in some cases, and also that there's going to be a continuous source for 500 years, which was recently updated from being an infinite source. So from a oil and gas company advisor's perspective, there's obvious cost benefits to considering realistic guidelines, as in tier 2 guidelines, if they're appropriate. But there's also other environmental, I'd argue that there's environmental benefits to using tier 2 guidelines. We're not needlessly excavating and landfilling soil, so we're conserving soil, and we're also decreasing fossil fuel use from trucking, and also reducing potential health and safety issues by not having those trucks on the road. I'm a strong proponent of not remediating if it's over a certain volume threshold. I think you need to consider tier 2 guidelines before you start a soil excavation or install an in situ system such as a soil vapor extraction system. We need to plan ahead and understand the site before going to remediation, because that's really where the cost savings are, right? Is once we get to that phase, the numbers do go up quite a bit. So I think there are certain guidelines that we should be that are easy to implement for and at least consider for almost any site. So I'll just go through. I'm going to call them easy win sites, tier 1 and 2 guideline exclusions, because I think they're fairly straightforward. The first one is excluding the freshwater aquatic life pathways if surface water bodies are greater than 300 meters down gradient or 100 meters cross gradient or up gradient. Pretty straightforward approach if your water bodies are greater than 300 meters away from the site. Water lines being excluding protection of potable water pathway, which is the most stringent pathway for hydrocarbons, one of our most common contaminants for a long time now. And I think that this is also something that should be considered more frequently. I've read some reports where direct ecological contact guidelines are being considered for subsoil, and once again, you're basically being very conservative, but you're also protecting something that doesn't exist. Finally, the petroleum hydrocarbon fraction F2 and F3 in soil guideline modifications for management limits and natural land use areas. Sorry, that's quite a mouthful. Those are all, you know, if you go through the regulatory guidance, it's pretty straightforward. There's, you know, well, just easy to understand stop gates. And then, yeah, we can take things a bit further, and I think as an industry we should go this way more. Waterline's been doing a lot of tier 2 adjustments that use the tier 1 model and incorporate site-specific information to give a realistic sense of risk and a realistic sense of remedial endpoints. We've been able to actually do them if all the data is there. It can be a fairly low-cost exercise and because it's done in a relatively straightforward manner, that's, you know, like an Excel-based format, it's easy for regulators to test the sensitivity of the input parameters, which makes it, I think, a logical approach to work with regulators on. And it's been an approach that I think has been we've seen success with for a variety of contaminants that are most common in upstream oil and gas sites, so PAHs, salinity, and hydrocarbons. And then to supplement those tier 2 guideline adjustments, we've also been working with some relatively straightforward modeling that can also be done at a low cost that really aligns and creates good perspectives about actual receptor risk, and it's not as black box as some of the other approaches. I also think we should be moving towards considering groundwater surface water interactions a bit more on sites with more significant issues. If there's no pathway for the groundwater to reach surface water, especially at sites that are higher up in the watershed, we should be accurately assessing receptor risk and pathway, real pathways that matter. And then finally, I think eventually maybe it's not as straightforward as pathway arguments, but considering ecological risk to surface water bodies seems like a logical place to go, so that we can protect the aquatic resources that exist and not necessarily the things that don't exist, which due to there being a limited toxicological database, we sometimes do. So when we're assessing, so once we've considered the appropriate guidelines and we understand the geology and the pathways, we're almost there. We've already considered all of the receptor risks, and we're likely good to go. We understand the site. So in conclusion, I think that we should be taking a holistic approach to managing environmental issues. We should be considering soil and water when conducting environmental work, and do our best not to separate them. As I think I've said a number of times, understanding geological pathways is essential to establishing your site conceptual model and your basic understanding of the site in general. I think if you haven't noticed yet, that I think that Tier 2 guidelines are really the way that we should be going, and they should be considered on a more regular basis. And they don't have to necessarily be they can be done in an incremental staged way that will allow you to optimize the resources and to stop if they aren't looking, if it looks like, say, a Tier 1 guidelines or are more appropriate. And then finally, like, I do believe that collaboration and integrating our practices, working together, will ultimately create positive outcomes. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Brent and Waterline. Appreciate that. I have a few questions here for you so far. If you guys have been on before, you know how the system works. You can type in questions. I will try to read as many as possible to Brent, and we'll go through them. Also, as a reminder, the presentation as a PDF and the video file should be available on our webinar page, hopefully by the end of the day. So Brent, how should receptors be modified for fen, bogs, and muskeg?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we do consider the pathway to them, that's probably the best way to manage it. I have always been curious about defining what an actual water body is. The regulatory guidance, there's some regulatory guidance for water crossings, but I've never personally seen something formal about what is a water body. Is a puddle a water body? Or, you know, and is muskeg about a water body? Where do you draw the line from an environmental perspective? So it's not really answering it's a very good question, and it's a question that I have as well. So.
Okay. Could you elaborate on management? Could you elaborate on management limits pathway for hydrocarbons? Can this pathway be excluded?
So it can be. Sorry, it shouldn't be. It isn't an exclusion. It's basically changing the value of the management limits for hydrocarbon fractions F1, F2, and F3. So I think it is valuable especially if if you can exclude the protection of the freshwater aquatic life pathways and the protection of potable water pathways, that's when you really start to see the management limits becoming an influence. It's you can, if you search for something comparable to what I listed there, you'll find the guidance document that Millennium helped to create with Alberta Environment.
Okay, looks like I have two more for you. What holistic strategies would you suggest when responding to a spill that involves soil and groundwater interaction? What questions to ask from the get-go to make sure you aren't missing a chance to collect the right information?
Yeah, I guess there's no specifics, I guess, huh?
No, just
yeah.
What strategy would you suggest for responding to a spill that involves soil and groundwater interactions, and what questions to ask from the start to make sure you aren't missing a chance to collect the right information?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the nice with spills, you actually know, an actual source. You can the quality will tell you which way to go, and how to most effectively address the problems. If there's a question of whether there's actually in a situation where it's a water body in the upper reaches of a watershed, I think they're just installing some wells next to that surface water body and understanding how connected the surface water is with the groundwater. Maybe in putting a logger in or something like that would be a first step. In other situations, it's pretty obvious, right? Like it's pretty obvious in a spill. Spills will be in low-lying areas that often have water bodies in them. So.
What about traditional cultural uses of the landscape as receptors? How does Tier 2 address chemical mobility in the food chain, not just direct injection or exposure?
Well, I guess, yeah, the direct ecological contact pathway is designed to account for that kind of those ingestion situations. I think, I mean, once you get to direct ecological contact, you are looking at Tier 2 will not be as effective, I think. Like you can't, at least the guidance that I've been provided, you can't really adjust those values. So it's more about, from my perspective, we're often focusing more on the surface water bodies and potable water resources.
Okay. I got one last question, and there's a comment with the question. So the comment was, by the way, wetlands are distinguished by qualified personnel by the type of vegetation, i.e. sedges. That was a comment. If proposing a Tier 2 approach, would the landowner be entitled to financial compensation for assuming the additional environmental risk?
I don't think so they're just worried about the regulatory uncertainty attached with using a Tier 2 approach, which I mean, we do have that REMREC questions email that AER has that is pretty useful for answering some of those types of questions. I think as far as we can obviously, to go back to the comment, we can distinguish obviously between the water bodies, but how do we distinguish the actual risk to those water bodies is, I think, more what I was talking about. So hopefully that answers the question. It's hard to know.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Brent, and thank you, Waterline, and thank you everyone for participating today. We have 2 more webinars this week, so hopefully you'll tune in. Thank you again, everyone, and take care.